The revolution has triumphed. Che Guevara, the hero of the guerrilla war, enters Havana as a liberator. But victory has a price, and power reveals a much darker side of the man behind the myth. Before continuing, if you haven't seen the first part, we recommend you do so. And if you are already here, subscribe to the channel to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers and motivate us to offer you even more historical content. The victory of the revolution was sweet, but the euphoria quickly passed. The victors faced two main tasks: to reward their supporters and to punish their enemies. And Che Guevara fully immersed himself in the second. The La Cabaña fortress, which he commanded, became the main center of revolutionary justice, or, as his critics would say, revolutionary vengeance. Che was appointed commander of La Cabaña and the highest authority of its Revolutionary Justice Commission. His task was to judge those considered war criminals of the Batista regime. These were army and police officers, secret service agents, executioners, and informants, those whose hands were stained with blood up to their elbows. The trials were swift and exemplary. The courts were not composed of professional jurists, but of officers from the rebel army. The accused were provided with lawyers, but the outcome of the trials was almost always decided beforehand. The evidence was usually the testimony of witnesses thirsty for revenge. Appeals were presented personally to Che, and he almost never accepted them. Every night, the walls of the old fortress trembled with the shots of the firing squads. The exact number of people executed in La Cabaña under Che's command remains a subject of heated debate. Some historians speak of 156 confirmed cases, while others cite figures up to 500. Che himself never hid his role. He did not consider himself an executioner. He considered himself a surgeon removing a cancerous tumor from the body of the nation. A controversial phrase attributed to him in a letter to his parents says, "I must confess, Dad, that I have discovered that I really like to kill." This sentence, taken out of context, would become one of the main arguments of his accusers. His supporters would claim it was black humor, sarcasm directed at his father, who knew his difficult character. But for many, these words became proof that behind the image of the romantic revolutionary hid a cold-blooded murderer. In parallel with the purge, Che dedicated himself to building a new state. He soon left his post as commander of La Cabaña and was appointed to key economic positions. First, he headed the Department of Industrialization of the National Institute of Agrarian Reform, which was responsible for the expropriation of land from large landowners. Then, in November 1959, Fidel appointed him president of the National Bank of Cuba. This appointment was a surprise to everyone. Che, a doctor and a soldier, a man who despised money and capitalism, was placed at the head of the country's entire financial system. It was not just an economic measure, it was a symbolic gesture. Fidel was showing the world that his revolution was not going to follow the old rules. When Che first signed the new Cuban banknotes instead of his full name, he ironically wrote only Che. These banknotes became a collector's item. As president of the National Bank and later as Minister of Industry, Che began to put his economic theories into practice. He believed in central planning, in the nationalization of all industry, in the rejection of market mechanisms. He wanted to create in Cuba a new man who would work not for money, but for an idea, for conscience. He introduced a system of voluntary work, and he himself, as a minister, would cut sugarcane or work in construction on weekends. But reality turned out to be more complicated than theory. His economic experiments led to chaos. The nationalization of American property led to the imposition of a trade embargo by the United States that suffocated the Cuban economy. Attempts to rapidly industrialize a country that had lived off sugar for centuries failed. Products disappeared from store shelves and ration cards were introduced. The dream of prosperity was postponed, but Che was not concerned. He was willing to sacrifice the well-being of one generation for a great future, and he was sure he knew how to build that future. But for that, he needed a new, more powerful ally, and he found it in the Soviet Union. Having become the economic king of Cuba, Che began to actively approach the Soviet Union and the countries of the socialist bloc. He made several extended trips to Moscow, where he was received as a hero. The Soviet leaders, Khrushchev and his comrades, enthusiastically watched the bearded revolutionary in an olive-green jacket who said the right words about the fight against imperialism. They saw in Cuba a valuable foothold, an unsinkable aircraft carrier, just 150 kilometers from the coast of their main enemy, the United States. Che signed a series of advantageous trade agreements with the USSR. The Soviet Union committed to buying Cuban sugar at prices above world levels and to supplying oil, machinery, weapons, and industrial products to the island. Cuba, isolated from its traditional markets by the U.S. embargo, became completely economically dependent on Moscow. But Che did not care. He did not see it as dependence, but as fraternal aid. He was fascinated by the Soviet experience. He believed that central planning and state ownership were the only correct path to socialism. But the more he learned about the Soviet system from within, the more disappointment grew in his soul. An idealist who dreamed of the new man, he encountered the gray Soviet bureaucracy, the cult of material incentives, what he called state capitalism. He saw that the Soviets did not work for an idea, but for a salary, bonuses, and dachas. It was a betrayal of his ideals. Meanwhile, the United States was not willing to tolerate the existence of a communist regime on its doorstep. In April 1961, the CIA organized the landing of 1,500 Cuban immigrants in Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, or Playa Girón. The plan was almost an exact copy of the Guatemala operation, but this time things did not go well. Fidel and Che had learned the lesson of Guatemala. The Cuban army and the popular militia were prepared. The invasion was defeated in 72 hours. This victory further strengthened the regime and definitively pushed Cuba into the arms of the Soviet Union. It was precisely after this defeat in 1962 that the most dangerous idea in the history of the Cold War emerged, the idea of installing Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. The initiative came from Khrushchev, but the Cuban leaders, including Fidel and Che, enthusiastically supported it. They saw the missiles as the only guarantee against a new American invasion. Che, as one of the main military strategists, was directly involved in the planning of this secret operation. In the summer of 1962, amid strict secrecy, Soviet ships with missiles and military specialists began to arrive in Cuba. But in October, American aerial photographs revealed the existence of the launch pads. The world stood on the brink of a nuclear war. For 13 days, President Kennedy and Khrushchev balanced on the edge of mutual destruction. In the end, Khrushchev gave in first. He agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for Kennedy's promise not to invade Cuba and to secretly withdraw American missiles from Turkey. For the whole world, it was a relief, but for Fidel and Che, it was a betrayal. Khrushchev and Kennedy had reached an agreement behind their backs, treating Cuba as a pawn in their global game. Che was furious. He felt humiliated. In a controversial interview after the crisis, he is attributed with having declared that if the missiles had been under Cuban control, he would not have hesitated to press the button and launch an attack on American cities, even if it meant the destruction of Cuba itself. The missile crisis became a moment of truth for him. He understood that the Soviet Union was as imperialistic as the United States, that Cuba had no friends, that it could only rely on itself, and that the revolution had to be exported further. His gaze turned increasingly to the south, to his native continent, Latin America, and to Africa. The dream of creating many Vietnams began to take hold of his mind. After the missile crisis, something broke in Che's soul. His faith in the Soviet Union as the leader of the world revolutionary movement was undermined. He began to criticize the Soviet model of peaceful coexistence with capitalism more and more publicly. He saw it as a betrayal of the interests of the Third World countries, which were still groaning under the yoke of imperialism. His relations with Moscow became increasingly tense. At the same time, his economic experiments in Cuba were not yielding the desired results. He was the Minister of Industry, but industry was not developing. He was responsible for planning, but the economy was sinking into chaos. Discontent was growing in Cuba. Even among his former comrades from the Sierra Maestra, he had more and more opponents who considered his economic policy adventurous and harmful. They advocated for a more pragmatic and market-oriented approach. Che felt that he was losing influence. He was born for the struggle, for guerrilla warfare, for risk. The routine work of a minister, the endless meetings and the paperwork suffocated him as much as his asthma. He was a warrior, not a bureaucrat, and he began to look for a new front, a new war. In 1964, he embarked on a long 3-month tour of countries in Africa and Asia. He spoke before the UN General Assembly in New York, where he delivered a fiery speech condemning American imperialism. Then he went to Africa. He met with the leaders of national liberation movements who saw him as a living legend, a symbol of a successful revolution. And it was there, in Africa, that he decided he had found his new Vietnam, in the Congo. At that time, the Congo was the scene of a cruel civil war. After the assassination of Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, the country plunged into chaos. The government, supported by the United States and Belgium, was fighting against left-wing rebels who called themselves Simbas, meaning lions. Che saw in this struggle an opportunity to strike a blow against imperialism and ignite the flame of a continental revolution in Africa. In February 1965, he delivered his most scandalous speech at the Afro-Asian Seminar in Algiers. In it, he openly accused the Soviet Union of being as exploitative of Third World countries as the United States. He stated that socialist countries had an obligation to supply weapons and aid free of charge to liberation movements instead of trading with them. This speech was a slap in the face to Moscow and became a point of no return. After this, Che could not remain in Cuba. His paths with Fidel, who was forced to orient himself towards the Soviet Union, definitively parted. In March 1965, Che returned to Cuba and then disappeared. He simply vanished. No one knew where he was. The world was bewildered. The CIA believed that he had either been killed on Fidel's orders or was in prison. His mother wrote desperate letters to Fidel. Finally, in October 1965, Fidel publicly read Che's farewell letter. In it, Che renounced his Cuban citizenship, all his positions and titles. He wrote that other lands of the world claim the assistance of my modest efforts, and that he was heading to new battlefields to fulfill his revolutionary duty. At the moment Fidel was reading this letter, Che, unrecognizable, with a shaved head, glasses, and a fake passport, was already in the Congo jungle. He had arrived there with a group of 100 Cuban volunteers to lead the Simba army and turn it into a fighting force. The aristocratic doctor who had become a minister was once again a guerrilla. But this war was doomed to failure from the beginning and would become the greatest disappointment of his life, a disappointment that would cost him his reputation and his people their lives. When Che arrived in the Congo in April 1965, he was full of hope. He believed he could repeat the Cuban experience, that he would take the scattered Simba rebel troops, train them, discipline them, and lead them to victory. But the reality he encountered was a nightmare that surpassed his worst fears. He expected to find ideologically motivated freedom fighters, but found tribal militias mired in superstition and internal strife. The Simba rebels had not the slightest idea of Marxism or revolutionary theory. Their ideology was a mixture of animism and magic. They believed that a special spell they called dawa made them invulnerable to bullets. Instead of learning tactics and how to shoot, they performed rituals. Their attacks were chaotic and often ended in a hasty retreat at the first shots from the enemy. The rebel leaders were even worse. Most of them, including the future president of the Congo, Laurent Désiré Kabila, lived in comfortable hotels in neighboring Tanzania, enjoying alcohol and women, and only occasionally appeared on the front lines. They were more interested in smuggling and personal enrichment than in revolution. They constantly argued among themselves, wove intrigues, and did not trust Che, whom they saw as an outsider trying to seize power. Che tried to bring order, tried to impose the same iron discipline that had led him to success in the Sierra Maestra, but it did not work. To them, he was a white man, a foreigner who did not speak their language and did not understand their culture. His 120 Cuban veterans, black fighters specially selected for this mission, were a drop in the ocean. They were the only force capable of fighting, but they could not fight for everyone. They were not only facing Congolese government troops, but also squads of well-trained and ruthless white mercenaries from South Africa and Rhodesia, under the command of adventurers like Mike Hoare, nicknamed Mad Mike. And these professional killers did not believe in magic. The 7 months in the Congo became an endless nightmare for Che. He did not achieve any significant victories. His men suffered from tropical diseases. He himself suffered from dysentery, and his asthma had worsened to the extreme. In his Congolese diary, he described this failure with bitter irony. He wrote about the cowardice of the Simbas, about the corruption of their leaders, about the total absence of revolutionary consciousness. This is a story of a failure. That is what he would later call this chapter of his life. In November 1965, it was all over. The Tanzanian government, under pressure from other African countries, demanded that the Cubans leave the Congo. It was not a glorious retreat, but a shameful escape. Che and the remnants of his group were evacuated in secret. He suffered his most crushing and humiliating defeat. He, the symbol of the victorious guerrilla war, found himself powerless. He spent the next few months in hiding in the Cuban embassy in Tanzania and then in a clandestine villa near Prague. He was shattered. He was ashamed to return to Cuba defeated. He analyzed the reasons for his failure while writing a book about the Congolese epic. And in his head, a new plan was already maturing, the last and most desperate one. He decided that he had been wrong about the continent, that he had to go home to Latin America. He decided to light the fuse in the heart of South America, in a country that bordered his native Argentina, in Bolivia. It was his last chance, the chance to erase the shame of the Congo and prove to the world and to himself that he was still the same Che who took Santa Clara. A chance that would become his death sentence. In mid-1966, after several months of clandestine life in Europe, Che secretly returned to Cuba, but only to prepare for his final mission. He underwent an intensive training course and changed his appearance again. He shaved his head and beard, put on thick-rimmed glasses, and wore a set of false teeth. He became a middle-aged Uruguayan businessman named Adolfo Mena Gonzalez. Not even his former comrades could recognize him. His choice fell on Bolivia. On paper, it seemed like the ideal place, the geographical center of South America. The country bordered 5 others, including his native Argentina, where he dreamed of bringing the flame of revolution. The political situation was unstable, with a weak military junta in power. Most of the population was composed of poor indigenous peasants who, in his opinion, would enthusiastically support the revolution. In addition, the local Communist Party, led by Mario Monge, promised its unconditional support. In November 1966, under the guise of a Uruguayan businessman, Che arrived in La Paz. He then went to the remote Ñancahuazú area in the southeast of the country, where a ranch had been purchased with money from Cuba. This place was to become the base for training his new guerrilla army. Along with him came a small group of 17 Cuban veterans, his most loyal and proven fighters. They expected to be joined by dozens of Bolivian communists and, later, hundreds of peasants. But from the beginning, everything went wrong. The Ñancahuazú area, chosen for the base, turned out to be a very poor choice. It was an almost uninhabited and arid region, where it was difficult to find food and water. The local population, a few Quechua indigenous people, spoke their own language and were extremely suspicious of the Spanish-speaking outsiders. They did not understand what these strange bearded men wanted from them. The idea of agrarian reform did not interest them, because many of them already had their small plots of land obtained after the 1952 revolution. Then came the stab in the back from the Bolivian Communist Party. Its leader, Mario Monge, arrived at Che's camp for the New Year's meeting and gave him an ultimatum. He said that he would only support the guerrillas if he, Monge, was their political and military leader. Che, who considered himself the greatest specialist in guerrilla warfare, was enraged and refused. In response, Monge withdrew all his men from the detachment and, in fact, abandoned Che and his group to their fate. They were left alone in a foreign country, without the support of the local Communist Party, without the support of the peasants. And the Bolivian government, alerted by deserters from the group, already knew of their presence. President René Barrientos asked the United States for help. The CIA immediately sent its best counter-guerrilla specialists to Bolivia. They began to train and equip special units of the Bolivian army, the so-called Rangers, whose sole objective was to locate and destroy Che's brigade. Che's group, which numbered about 50 people, became a pack of cornered animals. They were forced to abandon their camp and constantly move through hostile terrain, suffering from hunger, thirst. Che's asthma worsened like never before. He had almost no medicine left. He was weak, but his will remained unshakable. In his Bolivian diary, he bitterly described the isolation, the indifference of the peasants, and the betrayal of the communists. But he did not think of surrendering. He believed he could change the situation as he had done before in the Sierra Maestra. He did not know that the CIA and the Bolivian army were already on his trail, and that he had only a few weeks to live. The spring and summer of 1967 were an agony for Che's group. They wandered through the Bolivian jungle like ghosts. There were only about 50 of them, but they had divided into two groups and lost contact with each other. Che's group desperately tried to find the main group, but all their efforts were in vain. They did not know that the second group had already been practically annihilated by the Bolivian army. The peasants, on whose support he had counted so much, not only did not help them, but feared and betrayed them. Every time the guerrillas entered a village to buy food, the locals immediately reported it to the army. A huge reward had been offered for any information about Che's whereabouts, and that was the best motivation. The troop constantly ran into ambushes, losing their men one after another. Che became a shadow of himself. His asthma had reached a critical point. He could barely breathe and moved with great difficulty, leaning on the shoulders of his comrades or riding a mule. His clothes were in tatters and he was exhausted to the limit, but his eyes still burned with a fanatical fire. In his diary, He continued to analyze his mistakes and plan future operations, as if he did not realize that the circle around him was closing in more and more each day. In August, the army dealt them a devastating blow. In one of the ambushes, almost the entire second group was annihilated, including Tamara Bunker, known as Tanya, the only woman in the group. Che lost his best fighters. His group was reduced to 22 people. They were trapped. In September, the CIA obtained decisive information. With the help of the latest American technology, they intercepted and deciphered the guerrillas' radio communications. Now they knew their exact location. The American advisors and the Bolivian rangers, specially trained to hunt Che, began to gather in the area. Che and his group spent their last days in the Quebrada del Euro. They were exhausted, hungry, and almost out of ammunition. They knew they were being hunted. On October 8, 1967, a local peasant discovered them. He immediately informed the army. Within hours, the canyon was surrounded. 650 Bolivian soldiers against the 17 remaining guerrillas. The battle was short and cruel. The guerrillas fought to the last bullet. Che, despite his condition, was on the front line. He was wounded several times. One of the bullets damaged his M2 rifle, preventing him from firing. Another hit him in the leg. He could not move. When the Bolivian soldiers approached him, according to legend, he shouted at them, "Do not shoot. I am Che Guevara. I am worth more to you alive than dead." He was captured along with another wounded guerrilla. They were tied up and taken to the nearest village, La Higuera. There he was locked in an old, dilapidated adobe schoolhouse. He was dirty, ragged, with matted hair, but he was not defeated. He looked at his captors with contempt. He refused to answer the questions of the Bolivian officers. When the Cuban-born CIA agent Felix Rodriguez entered the room, he spat in his face. Throughout the afternoon and night, encrypted messages flew from La Paz to Washington and back. What to do with the prisoner? The Americans wanted to interrogate him, but the Bolivian president, René Barrientos, was afraid. He feared that a trial against Che would become a world spectacle and give him even more fame. He feared they would try to free him. And he gave the order, "Finish Mr. Guevara." The order was signed. On the morning of October 9, 1967, a man entered a small school in La Higuera with the mission of carrying out that order. On the morning of October 9, 1967, in the small adobe schoolhouse in the village of La Higuera, everything was ready for the final act of the tragedy. The order from President Barrientos had been received. Che Guevara was to be killed, but it had to be done in such a way that it looked like a death in combat. A 27-year-old Bolivian army sergeant, Mario Terán, volunteered to carry out the sentence. He entered the room where Che was sitting on the dirt floor, leaning against the wall. What happened next has gone down in history and is surrounded by myths and legends. According to one version, Sergeant Terán hesitated. He did not dare to shoot an unarmed and bound man who looked at him with icy contempt. Then Che, seeing his indecision, uttered his last words. "I know you've come to kill me. Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." Terán fired. He fired 9 bullets with his semi-automatic rifle. He aimed below the waist to imitate wounds sustained in combat. The bullets hit him in the hands, legs, and chest. The fatal shot was the one that struck his heart. At 1:10 p.m. local time, Ernesto Che Guevara's heart stopped beating. The man was dead, but it was precisely at that moment that the myth began to be born. His body was transported by helicopter to the nearby town of Valle Grande. There, in the laundry room of the local hospital, it was placed on a cement table. The military called journalists and photographers to prove to the whole world that the legendary guerrilla was dead, and those photographs, taken that day, went around the world and became icons of the 20th century. They did not show a gaunt and dirty guerrilla captured in the ravine. His body had been washed and his hair combed. He lay with his eyes open, and his gaze seemed lost in eternity. He did not look like a dead man, but like a Renaissance painting, like Christ taken down from the cross. This image, created by his murderers to humiliate him, had the opposite effect. It turned him into a martyr. To be absolutely sure it was him, and to have irrefutable proof, the military made another gruesome decision. A military doctor amputated his hands. They were placed in a jar with formaldehyde to be sent later to Argentina for fingerprinting. Then, under the cover of night, Che's body and those of several of his murdered comrades were secretly removed from the laundry. They were buried in an unmarked mass grave next to the runway of the Vallegrande airfield. The place was leveled. The military was sure that no one would ever find his remains. They wanted to erase him from the face of the earth, but they were too late. The image of the dead Che with his eyes open had already begun its triumphant march around the world. In 1968, a few months after his death, the world was engulfed in student riots. Paris, Berlin, Mexico, Berkeley. Students took to the streets to protest against the Vietnam War, against the establishment, against capitalism. And on their banners, on their T-shirts, on the walls of the universities, there was one and the same image. A two-tone portrait of Che, created by the Irish artist Jim Fitzpatrick from a photograph taken by Alberto Corda in 1960. This image, known as Guerrillero Heroico, became a universal symbol of rebellion. Millions of young people who knew almost nothing about the real Che Guevara, about his harshness, about his economic failures, about his role in the executions, saw in that face the embodiment of their own hopes and aspirations. The revolutionary Che was dead, but the Che brand, the Che icon, was just beginning its life. And this posthumous life would prove to be much longer and more successful than his own. History took its most ironic turn. The irony of his posthumous fate turned out to be cruel and brilliant. The man who despised material goods, who fought against the consumer society, himself became the best-selling product. His face, reproduced on millions of T-shirts, posters and stickers, lost all connection with the real Ernesto Guevara. It became an empty symbol in which everyone could put their own meaning. For some, it was an icon of romantic rebellion. For others, simply a fashion accessory. The capitalism he so hated absorbed him, digested him, and spat him out in the form of a brand. His image was used in advertising for Swiss watches, French perfumes, and even Smirnoff vodka. His face was printed on bikinis, lighters, and computer mice. Rock bands put his portrait on their album covers, and Hollywood actors wore T-shirts with his image without having the slightest idea who he really was. The revolutionary Che, with all his contradictions, cruelty, and ideological convictions, was dead. Only the Che brand lived on, easy to sell, politically correct, and absolutely safe. But while the world commercialized his image, a mystery remained unsolved. The mystery of his grave. For 30 years, the location of his burial was a state secret of the Bolivian regime. But in the mid-1990s, after the fall of military dictatorships in Latin America, the searches began. Cuban and Argentine scientists, armed with georadars and eyewitness testimony, began to methodically investigate the area of the Vallegrande airfield. The key information was provided by one of the retired Bolivian generals who participated in the burial. He drew a diagram. In July 1997, almost 30 years after his death, the search was successful. In the mass grave, the remains of 7 people were found. One of the skeletons was missing its hands. The forensic examination, the comparison of the skull structure with photographs from his lifetime, and the dental analysis left no doubt. It was him. 30 years later, Che Guevara was returning home. His remains were transferred with honors to Cuba. Tens of thousands of people took to the streets of Havana to bid farewell to their commander on his final journey. But his final destination was not the capital. His final destination was the city of his greatest glory, Santa Clara. There, in the city he once took by storm, a grandiose mausoleum was built for him. Under a huge bronze statue that depicts him with a rifle on his shoulder, in complete silence, his remains were buried along with those of his 6 comrades found in the same grave. Fidel Castro, already an old man, delivered the farewell speech. The Cuban Revolution recovered its prodigal son and made him an official saint. Today, he lies there, in his mausoleum, an object of adoration for some and a symbol of tyranny for others. But his other self, his commercial double, continues to live its own life, bringing millions of dollars to the same capitalists he swore to destroy. They remain 2 different people, a historical figure full of contradictions and an empty but infinitely marketable image. He dreamed of creating a new socialist man, but instead, the capitalism he so hated turned him into its most successful product and sold him to the whole world. If this journey into the hidden history of Che has impacted you, give it a like, share your opinion in the comments, and subscribe for more documentaries that dare to tell the truth. Until next time.